Hello everyone, my name is Chad Crowell, and we're going to be going through the first tweet of the Learn Kubernetes in 10 Tweets, which is describing from a very high level what Kubernetes is. So we see the diagram here, which lists an example microservices application, and what that gets turned into when it's running on top of Kubernetes or in Kubernetes. So it says Kubernetes is a platform for deploying distributed applications inside of many different containers. So if we take a look inside of our Kubernetes cluster here, we can see by running kubectl get nodes that we have the control plane components, and then we have the worker nodes, which do not have any roles. So those are two different types of the two main different types of the components in Kubernetes. You can see the components running inside of pods, which is something we'll get to in another lesson as far as describing pods in detail. But just quickly, we can do kubectl get pods in the kube system namespace and see all of our control plane components. So we see core DNS, which provides DNS. We have the etcd cluster, which is the key value store for our configuration data, so all of our configuration in Kubernetes. We have our API server, which handles every call into the Kubernetes cluster. The kube controller manager, which is responsible for running the applications running in Kubernetes. The kube proxy, which is responsible for traffic inside of our cluster, and more specifically resolving service names to pods so that you make sure that when the service gets called, it's accessing the right pods. The kube scheduler, which is responsible for scheduling pods to nodes. And then we've installed a container networking interface called WeaveNet. A container networking interface, or a CNI, is responsible for the traffic from pod to pod and node to node in terms of resolving that communication inside of the cluster. So all of our Kubernetes components can talk to each other. And if we clear the screen, we can see this microservices application running inside of our cluster. So we can do kubectl get all. And we'll see we have a stateful set, a replica set, deployment, services, and pods, all running the same application, able to talk to each other in the same cluster. And so this is called a distributed system, or a decoupled group of services that are able to communicate with each other and work together to function as a single application, but it's not a monolith, it's a microservices architecture. And one more thing I want to show you, if I clear the screen again and look at all the resources that could be created in Kubernetes in addition to the ones that we just looked at, we can run the command kubectl api-resources with the namespace equal to true. That's another thing too with Kubernetes clusters. There's a namespace inside of a cluster which represents its own virtual cluster, which means it's isolated from other namespaces. And so there are resources that are only available within a namespace, and then there are resources that are available outside the namespace or cluster-wide. So I just output this command, which lists just the names out to a file named namespace resources. So let's take a look at that. And here we see all of the possible resources that we could create in Kubernetes. So if I go to the top here and I go down, we can see all the possibilities.